Imagine stepping onto a first-class flight, expecting a peaceful journey, only to find yourself unexpectedly humiliated by the very crew entrusted to make your experience seamless. Walter Bennett, a dignified elderly man, boarded the plane with a heart full of joy, ready to surprise his son, the pilot. But by the time the plane touched down, what should have been a heartwarming reunion unraveled into a confrontation that sent shockwaves through the airline. The twist: you won't believe his son's reaction when he learned what had unfolded at 30,000 feet. Walter Bennett had lived a life rich with experiences, one marked by the serene wisdom of a retired teacher in his late 70s. His eyes carried a sparkle that hinted at decades of stories untold, while his calm demeanor could quiet a room. Today, though, his focus was singular: a surprise visit for his son Jackson, a pilot whose success was the source of Walter's deepest pride. Jackson had spent years chasing his dream, inspired by childhood afternoons spent watching planes soar over their small Louisiana hometown. This flight wasn't just a trip for Walter. It was a chance to witness his son's world and share a memory they'd cherish forever. Dressed sharply in a dark blue suit, Walter made his way through the bustling Denver International Airport. His hands, steady despite the faint tremor of age, clutched a boarding pass that read first class. The air was filled with the hum of travelers, but no one noticed the quiet man checking in. He carried no airs of entitlement, only excitement. As he passed through the gate, the flight attendants greeted him politely, their smiles brief but professional. Settling into his plush leather seat, Walter marveled at the surroundings. The soft blanket folded neatly on the armrest, the faint notes of soothing music drifting through the cabin. He let the pride wash over him. This was Jackson's world, a reflection of the heights he had climbed. Not long after he had settled in, a young flight attendant named Lizzie approached with a bright smile. Her cheerful demeanor was refreshing. "Good afternoon, sir. Can I get you anything before we take off?" she asked warmly. Walter, his own smile gentle, replied, "A little water, if you don't mind." Lizzie nodded and disappeared down the aisle. As she left, another attendant caught his attention. This one, Tom, tall and broad, carried an air of disapproval that seemed to follow him like a shadow. Walter felt Tom's lingering gaze as he adjusted in his seat, the man's expression hard and unreadable. Walter dismissed the unease, choosing instead to savor Lizzie's return with his water. Moments passed, but the discomfort Tom's presence brought lingered. Each glance, each slight turn of his head, seemed to convey an unspoken judgment. Walter sipped his water, the excitement for the journey ahead steadying him. He focused on the window view as the plane began to taxi, the engines rumbling softly beneath him. In the quiet moments before takeoff, Walter allowed himself to imagine Jackson's face when they met at the terminal, a shared moment of pride and joy. But the tranquility didn't last. Tom's coldness seemed to ripple through the cabin like a quiet storm. Walter noticed how other first-class passengers were greeted warmly, their requests met with smiles. When Tom finally passed his seat, he didn't stop or speak, only moving briskly as though Walter wasn't there. The contrast was stark, but Walter, ever gracious, let it slide. Then came Katie, another flight attendant with an air of politeness that felt practiced rather than sincere. Offering snacks to passengers one by one, her demeanor changed slightly as she approached Walter. Her hand paused midair. "Would you like a snack, sir?" she asked, her tone polite but tight. Before he could answer, she added with a faint smirk, "We have a few options, but I'm not sure they'll suit your taste." Her words were subtle, but the undertone wasn't lost on Walter. Still, he answered calmly, "I'll take whatever you have." As she handed him a packet, her eyes flickered with something like disdain before she turned and rolled her eyes as she walked away. Walter felt the weight of nearby stares from other passengers. The unease grew, inching its way into his chest. He told himself it was a misunderstanding. Perhaps the crew was having a rough day. Yet the incidents began to mount. When he asked Katie for a blanket, her hesitation was palpable. She glanced at Tom, who gave her a slight nod, as though silently approving the request. It was subtle but undeniable, a pattern of interactions laced with small pointed slights. When Katie returned with the blanket, she delivered another remark wrapped in thinly veiled condescension. "Careful with the lunch trays," she said with a half-smile. "Wouldn't want to stain that nice suit." Walter's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. Dignity had been his lifelong creed, one that taught him to rise above petty offenses. Still, this treatment was different. It wasn't just an offhand comment or an accidental oversight. It felt deliberate, personal, and unwarranted. Looking out the window, Walter tried to calm his thoughts, focusing on the reunion with Jackson, waiting on the other side of the flight. But the unease lingered. the excitement of the journey tainted by the cold undertones of his experience. At cruising altitude, the cabin came alive with the clinking of glasses and soft murmurs of conversation. Walter allowed the rhythms of flight to soothe him, imagining Jackson in uniform, the pride they would both feel when they finally embraced. Soon, the meal cart began its slow progression through the aisle. Walter watched as each passenger ahead of him received their meal with a smile and kind words from Katie and Tom. The anticipation built as they drew closer, but he braced himself, wondering what slight might follow next. The tray was poised in Katie's hands, the rich aroma of roasted chicken and pasta filling the cabin. Walter watched her approach, her expression a mask of strained politeness. "Here you go, sir," she said, holding the tray at an awkward angle above his head. The moment stretched, tense and uncertain, as Walter reached up to take it. But before his hands could steady the tray, her wrist twisted sharply. In an instant chaos, the steaming dish of pasta and sauce tumbled from the tray, splattering across Walter's head and shoulders. Warm sauce seeped into his neatly pressed suit, streaking the lapel with deep red stains. He sat frozen, the cabin's hum punctuated by gasps from nearby passengers. Katie's voice broke the silence, airy and devoid of genuine remorse. "Oh dear," she exclaimed, her lips curling into a faint, unmistakable smirk. "I'm so sorry, sir. Looks like I'm a bit clumsy today." Walter blinked, his composure shaken but not broken. His years as a teacher had taught him to withstand far worse indignities. But this moment cut deeper than mere discomfort. His voice, calm yet firm, finally emerged. "Could you bring me a napkin?" Katie's smile didn't waver. "We seem to be out, unfortunately," she said, her tone laced with mock concern. Without another word, she turned back to the cart, pushing it along as if nothing had happened. Walter reached into his pocket for his handkerchief, dabbing at the sauce clinging to his collar. Around him, passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some watched with pity, others whispered behind cupped hands, but none intervened. Across the aisle, Tom stood with his arms crossed, his stern gaze locked on Walter, the faintest trace of satisfaction etched into his features. The humiliation simmered beneath Walter's skin, but he refused to let it consume him. He straightened in his seat, shoulders squared despite the sticky discomfort. This trip was for Jackson, he reminded himself. His son's joy would eclipse this indignity, yet the sting lingered, compounded by the silent complicity of those around him. The meal service continued, the flight attendants moving through the cabin, as if nothing had transpired. Walter sat in silence, his gaze fixed out the window. The once exciting flight now felt interminable, the anticipation of seeing Jackson the only thread keeping his spirits intact. Finally, the plane began its descent. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their arrival. Relief coursed through Walter, mingling with exhaustion. He adjusted his suit, now marred with stains, and prepared himself for the moment he'd waited for, the reunion with his son. As passengers disembarked, Walter lingered, waiting until the cabin was nearly empty. Katie and Tom exchanged casual glances, their postures relaxed, their earlier actions seemingly forgotten. Walter rose, gripping his carry-on tightly, and walked toward the exit with quiet dignity. Just as he reached the doorway, a familiar voice called out, "Dad." Walter turned, his heart lifting at the sight of Jackson in his crisp pilot's uniform. His son's face lit up with joy, only for the smile to falter as he took in Walter's appearance. The stained suit, the tired lines etched in his face. "Dad, what happened?" Jackson's voice was low, the concern unmistakable. He scanned the cabin, his gaze narrowing as it landed on Tom and Katie. Before Walter could respond, Tom stepped forward, his confidence visibly shaken. Katie froze in place, her smile replaced by a look of uneasy recognition. Jackson's expression darkened, his voice steely. "Did you two treat my father like this?" Katie stammered, her face flushed. We didn't realize he was your father." "It was an accident, sir. An accident." Jackson's tone was sharp, cutting through the awkward silence. "Accidents happen, but your demeanor right now tells me this wasn't one. You knew exactly what you were doing." He stepped closer, his presence commanding. "I trusted this airline to treat passengers with dignity, and you treated my father with blatant disrespect. If this is how you behave, I can't imagine how you treat others." Walter, who had remained quiet, placed a hand on Jackson's shoulder, his voice gentle. "Son, it's all right. I'm here now. That's what matters." But Jackson shook his head, his anger unrelenting. "No, Dad. It's not all right. This behavior is unacceptable." He turned back to Tom and Katie, his voice firm. "I'll be reporting this. Both of you will be held accountable." Katie opened her mouth to protest, but Jackson's glare silenced her. She looked away, her confidence shattered. Tom stood rigid, his face pale, as Jackson's words hung in the air, a promise of consequences. Her face was a mix of shame and discomfort, the kind that comes when pretense shatters under scrutiny. Tom, however, clung stubbornly to his hardened expression, though the cracks in his confidence were evident. Jackson's focus shifted back to his father, his tone softening as he spoke. "Come on, Dad. Let's get you cleaned up." Walking side by side through the bustling airport, Walter felt an unexpected warmth. It wasn't just pride swelling in his chest for the man his son had become. It was gratitude deep and unshakable, for Jackson's fierce and unwavering support. This was no longer about a flight gone awry. It was about dignity, about standing firm for what was right, and about the profound impact of treating every person with respect, no matter their station or circumstance. They arrived at the airline's office, a sterile space that pulsed with quiet urgency. As Jackson calmly but firmly recounted the mistreatment to the management, Walter sat silently, observing his son. Jackson's posture was resolute, his voice steady yet edged with a sharp determination that refused to be ignored. Walter saw the reflection of his own values in Jackson, a man who wouldn't back down in the face of injustice. The airline's senior supervisor, a man introduced as Mr. Harlan, sat opposite them. His graying hair and lined face hinted at years of navigating crises, yet his serious expression betrayed unease. He nodded repeatedly as he scribbled notes, finally breaking the tension with a somber apology. "Mr. Bennett, I want to express my deepest regret for what you endured during your flight. This behavior is entirely unacceptable under any circumstances." Jackson leaned forward, his tone measured but unyielding. "Apologies are fine, but actions are what matter. Passengers should never feel disrespected, especially not by those responsible for their care and comfort. This isn't just about my father. This is about decency." Mr. Harlan cleared his throat, his discomfort palpable. "You have my word, Captain Bennett. This will be handled thoroughly. Effective immediately. Both attendants, Katie and Tom, are suspended pending investigation. Depending on the findings, they will face disciplinary measures, including retraining or termination." Walter, who had remained quiet until then, offered a small nod of gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice calm but heavy with exhaustion. "I appreciate your efforts to address this." The formalities concluded, father and son exited the office. The weight of the incident seemed to lift slightly as they walked together through the terminal. Jackson glanced at Walter, his voice tinged with regret. "Dad, I'm so sorry this happened. I thought the values I tried to bring to this airline would reflect in every flight, every crew member." Walter placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, his eyes filled with quiet pride. "You have nothing to apologize for, son. This wasn't your doing. What matters is that you stood up for what's right." Jackson's expression softened, his resolve clear. "You always taught me that respect isn't a privilege, it's a right. If addressing this helps others avoid what you went through, then it's worth it." As they left the terminal, the tension began to fade. There was no need for more words. The moment spoke for itself. This ordeal, unpleasant as it had been, had drawn them closer in ways neither had anticipated. Weeks passed, yet the memory of that flight lingered like an unresolved chord. Life moved forward, but for Walter, the experience was a stark reminder of how bias could rear its head in even the most neutral spaces. He reflected on it not with bitterness, but with a sense of purpose, convinced that Jackson's actions had sparked something meaningful. One crisp morning, a letter arrived addressed to Walter. Inside, he found a handwritten note from Mr. Harlan. The words were sincere, not perfunctory. Apologies were extended once more, but alongside them came something tangible: change. The letter detailed new training programs focused on empathy, respect, and anti-bias practices, mandatory for all airline employees. It confirmed that both Katie and Tom were under suspension, and all staff would undergo comprehensive retraining to ensure such incidents wouldn't recur. As Walter read the letter, relief washed over him. This wasn't empty rhetoric, it was progress. Concrete steps were being taken to hold people accountable and to foster an environment of respect. When Jackson visited that afternoon, Walter handed him the letter without a word. Jackson scanned the note, his brow furrowing, then lifting with a mixture of pride and satisfaction. "Dad, this is real progress," he said quietly. "It's a step in the right direction." Walter nodded, his voice steady and calm. "I was angry that day, not just because of how I was treated, but because they thought they could get away with it. But what you did, Jackson, standing up like that, it reminded me that change is possible. One step at a time." Jackson looked at his father, a determined glint in his eyes. And we'll keep pushing for it, Dad. One step at a time. As they sat together in companionable silence, watching the afternoon sun spill golden light through the window, they shared an unspoken understanding. This wasn't just a victory for them. It was a ripple in a larger tide of change. And as Walter gazed at the horizon, hope stirred within him, steady and unyielding. The world, despite its flaws, could indeed be made better.